Welcome to each of you to our gathering today, and thank you for helping us frame what our topic is today. You have exemplified for us that this is meant to be a safe and brave space for all of us to bring the truth of who we are and how we are doing. And it's an intentional step in us living into our identities as the body of Christ and holding one another in the truth of who we are and how we are doing. And as an additional way of framing our time today, I want to share with you a paraphrase from a book. It's a wonderful book, author Francis Weller, and the title is The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And it begins, "Grief has many moods and movements, shapes and textures. Sorrow carves a riverbed in our soul, deepening us as it flows in and out of our lives. There is something familiar about the rising and falling of loss, how it takes us below the surface of our lives and works on us in some alchemical way. We are remade in times of grief, broken apart and reassembled. It is hard, painful, and unbidden work. No one goes in search of loss. Rather, it finds us and reminds us of the temporary gift we have been given, these few sweet breaths we call life. At the same time, there is some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive." So back in March, when we first started hosting these conversations, we recognized that creating space to process our grief would be really important. But what we didn't realize was how layered and broad our grief would become as time moved on. Today, we are blessed to have the Reverend Solveig Nielsen Gooden, ELCA pastor, spiritual director, and grief ritual leader with us. She will be inviting us to step more deeply into the sacred work of grief, reflecting particularly today on the rituals that can hold sacred space for grief in our lives. Solveig, thank you for being with us.
I'm so grateful to be here with all of you. Grateful to you, Jill, and to Jason for holding this online space weekly for over 5 months now. Incredible. And I'm honored to be invited to join you today and the first Wednesday of every month for the next 6 months to hold space for this sacred work of grief. I want to begin today by just acknowledging that each and every one of us on this call is carrying grief in our bodies right now. Every single one of us is carrying grief in our bodies right now, recognized or unrecognized. And I may be wrong, but I would even venture to say that given enough time, given enough safety, given enough loving presence, there is not one of us who wouldn't cry an ocean of tears for all the grief that we carry. And so to begin our time today, I'd like to invite us into a tiny grief ritual. Nothing elaborate, just a few moments to acknowledge grief's presence in our bodies. So you are welcome to turn off your video if you have your video on right now, if you choose. Or you can keep it on. Either way, I invite you to close your eyes and turn your attention inward. Where are you most aware of grief residing in your body. For some, you might feel it in your heart or your stomach, tension in your shoulders. A couple years ago, I discovered that I was carrying tremendous grief in my hamstrings, of all places. Wherever you feel or you think you might be carrying grief in your body, just put your hands on that part of your body. And each time you breathe in, send your breath right to that spot. And now not only sending breath to nourish that tender place in your body, but I invite you to send love there too. Send love along with the breath. Breathing love into the tender places in your body that carry your grief. And now, with your most tender and loving voice, either out loud or in silence, I invite you to ask that place in your body if there's anything it would like to say right now. And listen for words or feelings. No need to do anything with them, just honor them with your witnessing. And we'll take a minute now just by breathing, loving, and listening. And when you're ready, I invite you to find a way to physically thank this precious, tender part of your body for bearing your grief. You might press your hand in a little deeper or give yourself a little embrace. And if you're willing, reassure that place that you'll come back and breathe and love and listen again. And when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and turn your video back on if you wish, and come back into this space. In a word or a phrase, do one or two people have something they could share about what they heard? What did your grief say? You can just unmute yourself briefly and share. Mine said, "I'm really tired."
Mine said, I hurt.
Mine said, pay attention to me.
Mine said, relax.
Yeah. If we listen, grief will tell us what it needs. So today I'm going to share a little bit about the importance of making intentional space to acknowledge and release grief, and why it can be so difficult to prioritize this sacred work. And then I'll say a word about 3 elements that I believe any ritual needs in order to be strong enough to metabolize grief. I was introduced to the language of metabolizing grief by both Frances Weller, who Jill quoted earlier, and Martine Prechtel. And I love that word because you think about it, to metabolize food is to receive it in one form and then change it into another form that can be utilized by our bodies to give us life. And we don't try to do this. We just create the space where this happens. The same is true for grief. So to metabolize grief is to receive it as pain or loss and to transform it into beauty and new life, into aliveness. So whereas unmetabolized grief only produces illness, pain, and more grief for ourselves and for others and our descendants, metabolized grief, grief allowed to speak its own language until it has said all it needs to say, can become transformed into beauty, into new life, new possibilities, into aliveness. So friends, all of us are carrying some unmetabolized grief in our bodies right now. Grief is everywhere, within and without. That's not to negate the presence of joy and happiness. It's not to negate hope and love. It's just the opposite. Because wherever there is love, there is the potential for joy and happiness and hope. But wherever there is love, there is also grief, because we will lose it. And because, friends, grief is born of 2 things: love and the absence of love. Grief is born of 2 things: love and the absence of love. And what part of our lives is not touched by love or wounded by the absence of love? And so whether we want to admit it or not, we encounter grief at every turn in our lives. We may encounter grief from losing people we love, or losing faith in what we had believed to be true, from legitimate expectations that are never met, or places within us that have never known love, from the profound pain experienced by ourselves and those around us and the world in which we live, or the pain of our ancestors, passed down from generation to generation. Grief is a constant companion of life. So given enough time, enough safety, enough loving presence, how many of us wouldn't cry an ocean of tears for all the grief we carry? But here's the thing: how many of us have access to enough time, enough safety, enough loving presence in our lives and in our culture to honor and metabolize all the grief we carry within us, individual and collective. And of course, by saying enough safety, I'm acknowledging that there's never a 100% safe place wherever humans are involved. But there needs to be enough safety for grief to metabolize. I think about what if that were the work of the church, to create enough safety for grief to metabolize. Is there anyone on this call who has that combination of enough time, enough safety, enough loving presence in your life to metabolize all your grief on a regular basis? If you do, tell us where, how, and with whom you live, because after the pandemic, some of us might be moving in. There are reasons that most of us don't have enough time, safety, or loving presence to metabolize our grief. There are reasons why we are swimming in a church and culture thick with unmetabolized grief. That could be a whole series in and of itself. But one reason I will share. Did you know that in the year 589, 62 bishops at the Third Council of Toledo officially prohibited public expressions of grief at Christian funerals? Officially prohibited public expressions of grief at Christian funerals. Let that sink in. Apparently, when Christianity became synonymous with the Roman Empire, which was actively creating grief by invading and conquering both peoples and lands, apparently there was no room for grief for Christians anymore. Apparently, grief isn't for conquerors. It's only for the conquered. Let that sink in too. But what is human in us knows that that is not true. That is a big lie. That grief is a part of being human. And the suppression of grief is therefore deeply inhumane. And so I'm so grateful that Jill and Jason have offered this space to give grief the honor it's due. And I invite you to come back on the first Wednesday of each of the next 5 months, where we'll be more deeply entering this topic of grief, especially using the 5 gates of grief that Francis Weller talks about in his book that Jill mentioned earlier. Those gates of grief, in his words, are everything we love, we will lose. The gate of the sorrows of the world, the gate of ancestral grief, the gate of what we expected but did not receive, and the gate of the places that have not known love. There are likely many, many more gates through which we enter the vast territory of grief, but these gates are wide and worthy of our exploration. So let's turn back to the importance of holding ritual space for grief. Again, in the words of Francis Weller, there's a good deal of evidence that supports our need to work with the difficult emotion of grief, which inevitably finds its way into our lives. An apprenticeship with sorrow offers us the chance to build our capacity to stay present when the intense feelings of grief arise. And I'll add, when that happens in our own lives or in our world and what's happening around us. Through meaningful rituals, we are offered the opportunity to develop a living relationship with loss. We can recover a faith in grief that recognizes that grief is not here to take us hostage, but instead to reshape us in some fundamental way, to help us become more mature selves, capable of living in the creative tension between grief and gratitude. Friends, I believe that the times in which we are living are crying out for us to become our mature selves, for us to build our capacity to stay present with the intense feelings of grief, whether our own or others, and for us to become capable of living in that creative tension between grief and gratitude. I believe that it's in that creative tension that new ways of life emerge, especially at times when it seems like there is no way forward. So there are 1,000 ways to talk about rituals in general and rituals to metabolize grief in particular. But for today, simply put, a ritual is an intentional embodied action. That's all, an intentional embodied action. But a ritual that is capable of helping us metabolize grief is an intentional embodied action that has enough time, enough safety, enough loving presence for grief to be recognized and released. So no matter how simple or elaborate a ritual is, if there's not enough time, safety, or loving presence, it likely won't be strong enough container for grief to metabolize. So let's take the tiny ritual that we did at the beginning as an example. Now, granted, there may be some of you for whom that was not particularly effective, and that's okay. But it was an intentional embodied action that had each of those 3 elements. The time wasn't long, but we set apart time, even a few minutes. We created the possibility of enough safety for grief to reveal itself by closing our eyes, turning off our videos. And we invited in loving support through our breath. And we gave ourselves loving presence through our hands and our listening and our gratitude. And in that tiny ritual, we opened the possibility for grief to reveal itself and to begin to transform itself into beauty and new life. In the grief rituals that I have led or that I have participated in, creating time, safety, and loving presence can range anywhere from simply lighting a candle and praying for myself or praying for others' griefs, together or alone, to much more elaborate processes of setting aside a day or several days for a grief ritual, creating altars, making explicit agreements with participants around confidentiality, creating safety and loving presence by literally spotting one another and keeping each other physically safe as the intense emotions of grief find their expression in singing, dancing, shaking, shouting, weeping, wailing. But for most of us, most of the time, creating rituals to metabolize grief will probably be on the simpler, less elaborate end. And for us in COVID time, they will likely be more solitary than communal, except when we can do this online together. But with enough time, enough safety, enough loving presence, any intentional embodied action can help us turn grief into beauty, into new life. So friends, listen to what your own grief tells you. Have faith in grief. It is longing to make you alive and to become beauty for this weary world. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I'll turn it back over to you, Jason and Jill.
I need a minute to find my voice. Thank you, Solveig. That was extremely powerful. You have opened sacred space for us to be in as we journey with our grief. So as we prepare to go to our breakout rooms, here are 3 questions that we can take with us that Solveig has prepared for us. The first being, in the safety of your small group, how would you describe the grief you feel right now? The second question being, how might you re-envision grief, not as events in your life, but as an ongoing conversation with a difficult and holy visitor that accompanies you throughout life? And then the third question, being the one that abides with us every week as we meet, what is your next most faithful step related to your grief? So again, we remind you that the breakout room time is your time to speak the truth of who you are and how you're doing, to listen or to simply be, and to also listen for God's invitation as you take your next most faithful step. We will open the rooms in a minute. On most devices, you will be sent there automatically. Some of you may need to click the join button in order to move there. We will all come back to the large gathering a little before the hour, and Jason will send a 5-minute warning before this happens. As always, if you have any questions or concerns during this time, please notify us by clicking the Ask for Help button. Friends, again, thank you for helping to create this safe and sacred space today, and may God bless your conversations.
We have just a few minutes, and so I just ask maybe 1 or 2 people, what did you discover? What's your next faithful step?
Recognizing from what you talked about and what we were discussing, that a person without grief is a person who's lived without love.
We talked about grief being a part of us, not something that's separate, that it's intricately woven within us. And even though sometimes it hurts, that we're glad that it's there because it shows love.
Yeah. Yeah, grief and love.
It's like pain. We need it, but we don't want to be overwhelmed by it.
Right.
And in my group, there was a sense that it is so pervasive right now that it is overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All the more important to do anything that we can to hold those spaces and to honor it.
Towards the last, we did talk about lament and use of that form of, of lament, communal lament, and how powerful that can be.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Giving language is what we're doing, is we're giving language to our grief. And that we can do on Zoom. You know. Okay, Jill, I'll invite you to do the final words that you need to share.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again, Solveig, for shepherding us in this sacred space. And I want to again bring a heartfelt thanks to all of our ELCA coaches who support our breakout rooms and come faithfully every week. And friends, participants, I thank you for helping to create this safe space, and hope that you choose to join us again. I wonder, as we go away every week, I wonder what emotions you're walking away with and what has stirred in your hearts. And today I want to name that if you are battling a sense of hopelessness, I really especially encourage you to join us next week, as our guest speaker is activist Sarah Jackson. She is the author of The House That Love Built: Why I Opened My Door to Immigrants and How We Found Hope Beyond a Broken System. Because how many of us feel like things are so broken, there is no hope? Sarah has an amazing story to share. And so again, thank you for joining us today. And Solveig, I invite you to please share a final word of blessing with us as we prepare to go. And at the top of the hour, I will stay on for an extra 30 minutes for some additional informal conversation and time of prayer.
Yeah. So friends, just go with these words that God is love. And therefore grief is also at the heart of God. So listen to God and listen to your grief. Have faith in God. Have faith in your grief. Both are longing to give you new life and become beauty for our weary world. Go in peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, friends.